This story is incredibly detailed, so I am going to get right into the facts of what happened. I want to share only the most relevant details with you, because I think that is the best way to understand the gravity of the situation. I am currently 22 years old, and I freshly graduated from college just a few months ago. Since I was about 3 or 4 years old, my family has lived in a large 3-story home located in a relatively nice, quiet area. If you are picturing the quintessential suburban neighborhood with manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, and families walking their dogs, you have the exact right idea. As for the actual layout of our house, there are only a few key things you need to know to visualize how all of this played out. My bedroom is on the 2nd floor, and it has a large window that faces directly out toward the front street. Right above my room, on the 3rd floor, is my dad's home office. The only window in his office also faces the street, giving him a perfect high-angle view of the entire front yard and the road below. That is the basic setup of the house. The reason I am telling you all of this is because after the events of last week, I am now 100% convinced that something deeply sinister is happening to my family. It is for some inexplicable reason that I cannot even begin to conceive of. And if I am connecting the dots correctly, which I am pretty sure I am, this targeted surveillance has been going on for years. The very first relevant thing happened so long ago that I do not even remember exactly how old I was at the time. I was young enough to still be in middle school, so it had to have been at least 10 years ago. It was either a Saturday or a Sunday morning, because I did not have school that day, and I remember waking up late. As I was walking downstairs to the kitchen to grab some breakfast, I overheard my parents talking in hushed, tense voices. I did not catch the entirety of the conversation, but I was able to hear my dad talking about how something had happened again. He kept repeating that phrase, and it was clear he was very concerned, judging by the serious, worried tone he was using. My parents did not tell me what was going on when I walked into the kitchen and asked them about it. They actually brushed it off and did not tell me directly for over a year afterward, but I ended up learning the real story just a few days later from my older brother, who had overheard the full conversation. My dad is a lawyer and often works late into the night at home, whenever he is pressured to finish a case that he did not get done at his law office. And that is exactly what he was doing until about 2 in the morning on the night before I overheard him talking to my mom. According to my dad, he was working away at his mahogany desk at around midnight when he noticed a dark Chevy Suburban drive down our street at about 5 miles per hour. That is not an exaggeration. He claims to this day that the large SUV looked like it was literally crawling down the asphalt, as if someone had taken their foot completely off both the gas pedal and the brake, and was just letting the vehicle idle forward. My dad did not think much of it at first, assuming it was just a neighbor looking for a lost pet or a delivery driver trying to find an address in the dark. But then he saw the exact same Chevy Suburban drive back down the street. Only this time it was moving in the opposite direction, and then, even more strangely, the vehicle actually pulled over and parked directly across the street, right in front of our house. My dad did not take his eyes off the vehicle for a good few minutes straight. He stood by the 3rd floor window, waiting to see whether someone would get out of the SUV or if it would drive off. But neither of those things happened. The car just sat there in the pitch black with its headlights turned off. My dad did not have the time or the patience to devote the rest of his night to watching a parked car, so he went back to working on his legal documents, glancing out the window every so often out of curiosity. But nothing changed for hours. He swore that no one ever got out of the vehicle because he would have easily noticed the movement or the interior lights turning on. Eventually, he fell asleep right at his desk around 2 in the morning without even completing his work. But here is the crazy part. When he woke up around 5:30 in the morning, the Chevy Suburban was still sitting there in the exact same spot. What happened while he was asleep remains a complete mystery. But my dad said he was so shocked to see the vehicle still there when he woke up that he thought he was dreaming. The car ended up leaving just before sunrise. Even after finishing his work, my dad was so unsettled by the whole experience that he could not go back to sleep. I would eventually learn that this was not the first instance of something similar happening. My dad had seen strange cars driving back and forth on our street late at night before, but this was definitely the strangest. No one in our family really thought much of it for several years, though. We figured it was most likely just someone sleeping in their car in a very coincidental spot, or at the very worst, it was someone driving around random nice neighborhoods and casing houses for future burglaries. Fast forward a few years. I was 15 years old, a sophomore in high school. I remember the second occurrence much more distinctly, partly because it was more recent, and partly because it actually happened directly to me. I was up late making music beats in my bedroom, which was something I did quite often during that time in my life. Like I mentioned earlier, my room has a large window that faces the street, and my desk was positioned right in front of it, meaning I always had a clear view outside. I was vibing out with my headphones in, focusing on the computer screen, when a sudden movement from outside caught my eye. It was a little flicker of light. Definitely unnatural, and definitely not my imagination. I diverted my attention from my computer screen to the window and saw the strangest, most unsettling thing. There was a squadron of cars, at least 3 of them, driving down the street at an incredibly slow speed. That by itself was weird, but I quickly realized that the people in the cars were shining bright flashlights directly at the houses they passed. That was where the flicker of light had come from. I kept watching in a state of confused anxiety as whoever was in the lead vehicle swept their flashlight beam across the house next to mine. Then they started shining their light directly at my house. I actually ducked down underneath my windowsill when I realized the bright beam was about to sweep right past my open window. Not 2 seconds after ducking down, I watched as the powerful flashlight beam illuminated my bedroom ceiling for a couple of seconds before everything went completely dark again. I waited a good 20 seconds in the dark before slowly re-emerging, and by the time I looked back out, the 3 cars were much further down the street. I watched as they reached the end of the block and turned off. You can probably imagine how I was feeling in that moment. It was incredibly tough to get much sleep after that. I obviously told my parents about the incident the next morning, and as a family, we collectively agreed that it was a group of thugs casing the neighborhood, probably looking for homes with no one inside that would make easy targets for a home intrusion. My dad ended up installing a Ring camera on the front door after that, and he even put some security cameras with motion-activated lights in our backyard. I cannot remember for sure, but I think my parents might have talked to a few of our neighbors to see if anyone else had experienced something similar, but nothing came of those conversations. A couple of years later, the next strange thing happened. While doing some extensive landscaping in our backyard, one of the contractors my dad had hired claimed to have found a small hidden camera tucked into one of the thick bushes near our wooden fence. It was tiny, no bigger than a car key, but it was definitely a functioning camera. It was battery-powered, and by the time the contractor found it, the battery had long since died. The camera did not have a SIM card or any kind of memory card inside, which meant it was not storing any footage locally or using cellular data to transmit the files. But that did not rule out the possibility that it had been wirelessly streaming a live footage feed to an external receiver device parked nearby while the battery was active. My dad said the most likely explanation was that someone had been parked close enough to receive the live feed until the battery gave out. Why anyone would go through the trouble of hiding a camera on our property and then just leave it behind was a complete mystery to us. But it definitely was not the kind of thing that you stumble across by accident. As furious as my dad was, he could not figure out when or who had placed it there. Even after combing through the last few months of security camera footage, or at least everything the motion cameras had recorded and stored, he found absolutely nothing. For a while, I was convinced that one of my high school friends had been playing a prank on us. But even after pestering all of them about it, no one ever fessed up to placing that camera there. My parents were really worried that we were being targeted by someone, and they even reported the whole thing to the local police. But the home security system we already had installed was pretty top-notch, so it was not like we could upgrade things much more than we already had. Nothing happened for a little while after that. It was not like there was a constant dark cloud hanging over our heads. We all just kind of moved on with our lives, the way most people probably would. The next thing worth mentioning happened a few years after we discovered the hidden bush camera. Our immediate next-door neighbors moved away, and their house was re-inhabited super quickly. It was only vacant for a few weeks at most, which was not exactly unusual because our neighborhood has always been a very desirable place for families to live. However, I noticed pretty quickly that the people who moved in were not a family with kids, but just a youngish couple with no children. I remember finding that a bit odd considering the massive size of the house, but I assumed maybe they were planning on starting a family in the future, or maybe they just wanted a big place all to themselves. On several occasions after they moved in, though, I caught them looking directly into our backyard through their top-floor window. It was always at strange hours, either really early in the morning or really late at night. At first, I figured they just had a workstation or an office up there like my dad did, and they were just seated right in front of the window. But then I noticed they were always standing up whenever I saw them, which completely eliminated the desk hypothesis. I knew I was probably just being paranoid, but I am a pretty observant person by nature. If someone is doing something out of the ordinary, I am going to notice it. Either way, I did not think too much of it at the time. I just found it mildly amusing that our new neighbors seemed so fascinated with the layout of our yard or whatever else it was that they were always looking at. One night, while walking my dog down our street, I could not help but notice my neighbors in their kitchen through their big bay window. They were sitting at the dining table, and for the very first time since they had moved in, there was a third person sitting with them. The man had really distinctive, unforgettable features. He was fully bald, extremely muscular, and had the thickest, darkest eyebrows I had ever seen on a person. The three of them, the young couple and this muscular man, were just sitting there talking at the table. It seemed like nothing unusual was happening. But as if they suddenly noticed me looking at them from the sidewalk, the woman swiftly got up, walked over to the window, and pulled the heavy curtains completely shut. She did not actually look out the window at me, and none of them made direct eye contact. But I could not shake the feeling that she shut the curtains, because somehow she knew I was watching them. Either way, I did not forget about the man who had been sitting with them. His face was just so incredibly distinctive. Now, you are probably thinking that I am just some paranoid person who is reading too much into random coincidences. I mean, if I were reading this, that is probably what I would be thinking too. But I would never in a million years be sharing this story if what happened next did not happen. Like I said in the very beginning, this final event happened just last week, which was about another few years after the neighbor incident. A few weeks ago, my family took a vacation trip to Paris. My older brother had been dating his girlfriend for several years, and everyone was pretty much expecting him to propose to her while we were there, because we were traveling with her family as well. A few days into the trip, we were hanging out at a random, cozy bar in the city. Everyone was there, including me, my parents, my brother, his girlfriend, and her parents. We were sitting in a large booth, enjoying a few drinks and having some great conversation. I was maybe halfway through my drink, zoning out of the conversation for a moment, when I happened to glance across the room. There was a guy sitting completely alone in a booth, just casually sipping his drink and looking around the bar. Something about him seemed instantly familiar, but I could not immediately place where I had seen him before. But then, like a light switch had been turned on in my brain, I realized exactly who he was. It was that same bald, muscular man with the thick eyebrows who I had seen sitting at my neighbor's kitchen table years ago. There was absolutely no way. I did not want to believe it. What were the actual chances that this random guy from my neighborhood in the suburbs would be in the exact same bar as my family, in a foreign country thousands of miles away? I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence and that I was seeing things. But the more I stared at him, the more certain I became that it was indeed him. Then he caught me looking. We locked eyes for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. He knew, I knew, and he knew that I knew. I could literally feel the tension in the air. Then, without finishing his drink or even paying his bill, he got up from the booth and walked out of sight. I immediately excused myself from the table and tried to follow him outside. But by the time I made it to the street, I could not figure out where he had gone. I ended up just sitting back down at the table with my family, trying to suppress the nasty, sick feeling in my stomach. Telling myself that the guy just happened to be on vacation at the same time we were was the only way I could continue my night with my sanity intact. A few days later, we were doing some typical touristy sightseeing in broad daylight. We were just walking around the city when I saw him again. That exact same guy. I cannot understate how shocking and terrifying it was to see him a second time. If the first instance at the bar had just been a wild coincidence, this second sighting completely shattered that theory. He was standing maybe 50 feet away from us, snapping pictures with a professional-looking camera. I could not tell for sure, but it really seemed like the lens was pointed directly in our direction. Even though there was a famous monument right behind us, I watched him intensely as he then turned a corner and disappeared out of sight into the crowd. I finally decided to tell my parents about what was going on. I gave them every single detail and assured them that I was not going crazy. My parents actually believed me, my dad especially, and he was so concerned that he even suggested cutting the entire trip short and flying home. We did not end up doing that, but the rest of our vacation was completely ruined by the constant fear. When we finally got back home, my dad checked as much of our home security footage as was stored on the servers, but he did not find anything out of the ordinary around our property. I really do not know what to make of all of this. I do not know what these people want from us, who they even are, or why they are tracking us. But now I am fully convinced that they have been watching our family for over a decade. It sounds completely insane to say out loud, but the evidence is there, and I only have reason to believe that things are going to escalate from here. To give you some context for this next occurrence, I live very close to the Angel National Forest. I have been hiking those mountain trails for years, and I know them well enough that I do not really worry about getting lost or anything like that. I am highly comfortable out there in the wilderness. The night this all went down, I had gotten some really bad news over the phone earlier in the day. It was the kind of news that just makes you feel like you need to immediately get out of the house, walk off the stress, and clear your head. Some people choose to drink when they are upset, and some people call a close friend to vent. I go for a hike. It was around 8 in the evening when I set out for the trailhead. I was not planning anything too ambitious or difficult. I just wanted to clear my mind and maybe tire myself out enough so that I could actually fall asleep when I got back home. Night hikes are not unusual for me at all, especially on trails that I know like the back of my hand. There is something about being out there in the dark that usually feels incredibly meditative and peaceful. The thick fog that night was something else, though. I had checked the weather report before leaving my house, but conditions at high elevations are always a complete gamble. By the time I was a little ways into the trail, the visibility had dropped to maybe 20 feet. Everything beyond that was just a wall of gray mist. I tried using my flashlight at first, but the bright beam just bounced right back at me off the heavy moisture in the air. It actually made my visibility worse, like trying to drive with your high beams on in a heavy snowstorm. So, I mostly kept the flashlight turned off, letting my eyes naturally adjust to what little ambient light filtered through the trees. I had music playing out loud from my phone to deter any wild animals from bothering me, which was a safety tip I had picked up from my dad. About an hour into the hike, I noticed a very strange smell. It was faint at first, and I actually stopped walking for a second because it caught me so off guard. It did not smell like any kind of natural wood, pine, or forest scent. It actually smelled like sweet perfume. I know that sounds completely absurd, but that is genuinely what it smelled like. It was not incredibly strong or overwhelming, just a distinct floral scent that had absolutely no business being out there in the middle of a dense forest. I looked around, which was completely pointless, because the fog was so thick I could not see anything anyway. By the time I finished scanning the gray void, The perfume smell had completely vanished. I did not really know what to make of it, so I just brushed it off and kept walking. About 10 minutes later, though, there was a new smell. This time, it was something a little more familiar. It was the distinct scent of a campfire. I instantly connected the dots in my head, and assumed that there was someone camping somewhere nearby in the woods, and that also probably explained the earlier perfume smell. But the campfire smell was only there for about 30 seconds before completely vanishing as well, which was a little strange. It was not until I smelled the third scent that I thought something was really wrong. It was a herbal, almost earthy scent that I immediately recognized from my childhood, but I could not quite place what it was. The familiarity of the scent, combined with how completely out of context it was, in the middle of a foggy forest at night, deeply unsettled me. I probably should have turned around the moment things felt off, but I decided to keep hiking. Things went back to normal for a while, and I started feeling a bit better about everything. But as soon as I felt even the slightest sense of calm, I noticed a flashlight beam moving on the high ridge to my left. The ridge runs parallel to the main trail I was on, but it sits maybe 100 feet higher, and there are absolutely no marked trails or access points up there. I know this for a fact because I have looked at topographical maps of this area plenty of times, wondering if there was a way to get up there. The terrain is just too steep and dangerous. You would have to bushwhack through some seriously nasty, thick brush to reach that elevation from where I was standing, and yet there was clearly someone walking up there. The flashlight beam would turn on, sweep across a section of the steep ridge, then turn off, and then a few seconds later, it would turn on again somewhere else further along. In that very moment, I realized that listening to music was now a huge safety liability. If there was someone out there tracking me, my music was giving away my exact position. So, I quickly turned the music off and stood perfectly still to listen. Whoever was up on that ridge was whistling a tune. Whistling sounds normal enough in a suburban neighborhood, but hearing it out there really freaked me out. If I could hear them whistling, they would have definitely been able to hear the music I was just playing. At that point, I was several miles deep into the trail. The smart thing to do would have been to immediately turn around, but I did not want to. There was a familiar little scenic overlook spot up ahead that I knew about, so I told myself I would just make it to the overlook, take a quick break, and think things through. But as soon as I stepped onto the flat ground of the overlook, I saw something that made everything about 100 times worse. There was a small, hand-built stone sculpture sitting on a flat rock right near the edge of the overlook. I knew what that meant. It was a clear sign of recent human activity, and it felt like a marker. I instantly stood up, turned around, and started walking back the way I had come at a very brisk pace. But out of nowhere, I heard rapid, heavy footsteps approaching me from the direction I was walking. It was unmistakable. It was 100% a person's footsteps, not the light, cautious steps of an animal. I did not even have time to think. The footsteps were coming in so fast, and were already so close that all I could do was hold my ground, brace myself, and prepare for some kind of physical altercation. I did not even have the time to turn around and run, but as soon as the footsteps sounded like they were right on top of me, they just abruptly stopped. It was really, really scary. I kept staring intensely into the thick fog, but I could not see a single thing. Part of me thought that whoever had just charged at me was now standing perfectly still, somewhere just out of my limited field of view. But that did not make any logical sense. If I could not see them because of the fog, how in the world did they know exactly where I was to stop right in front of me? I waited another few seconds, in absolute terror, and then I slowly pulled out the sharp switchblade I always kept in my pocket for protection. I kept holding my ground, just waiting to see or hear something, waiting to be attacked. But now, there was just dead, heavy silence. I did not know what to do. I did not want to make any noise or announce my presence, but I was pretty sure whoever was out there already knew exactly where I was. The thing that made the situation so much worse was that the footsteps had come from the exact direction I needed to go to get back to my car. There was no alternate route down the mountain. If I wanted to leave, I had to walk directly toward where those footsteps had just come from. I tried to hold out and wait them out, but I knew I could not stand there in the freezing fog forever, so I started moving forward very slowly. I was fully expecting to bump into someone eventually, at which point I do not even know what I would have done with the knife. But the further into the fog I went, the more I started thinking that whoever had been there had somehow slipped away into the brush without me hearing them. The paranoia was excruciating. Every few minutes or so, I swore I heard one or two extra footsteps behind me, like someone was perfectly matching my pace from a short distance away. I kept quickly looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing but endless gray fog every single time. That psychological torment lasted for about a mile or so. It was easily the most tense, terrifying mile of my entire life. I was being actively stalked, and I was absolutely certain of it. Then, out of nowhere, something crashed heavily through the thick bushes somewhere directly behind me. It was so loud and sudden that I physically jumped. This time, I could not control my fear. I yelled something out as a pure, terrified reaction. I spun around to face the spot where the loud noise had come from, but once again, I could not see anything through the mist. At that point, I genuinely felt like I was going to lose my life in that dark forest. So I started running. I do not know why it took me so long to finally make the decision to run, but the moment I started sprinting, I did not stop until I made it all the way back to the safety of my car. And the entire time I was running, I could hear the distinct sound of branches snapping and brush crashing coming from somewhere behind me. I was definitely being chased, but I did not dare look back. I still consider it an absolute miracle that I made it back to my car in one piece and managed to drive away. I did not go hiking for several months after that experience, and to this day, I have never gotten an answer for what actually happened out in those woods that night. This final occurrence happened close to 20 years ago, back when I was only 15 years old. My parents were in the midst of a really ugly, dramatic divorce at the time, and my mom thought it would be a good idea for me to spend a few weeks away from all the fighting. She arranged for me to stay with my great-aunt Lucy in upstate Vermont while they sorted out all the complicated legal paperwork. I was not thrilled at all about being shipped off to some distant relative I barely even knew, but as a teenager, I did not have much of a choice in the matter. Aunt Lucy lived in this massive, old Victorian house that had been converted into 3 separate apartments sometime back in the 1960s. She owned the entire building and rented out the top 2 floors to tenants, while she lived alone in the sprawling, spacious first-floor unit. The place was incredibly beautiful in a very specific, old-fashioned kind of way. It had high ceilings, original dark hardwood floors, and intricate crown moldings around every doorframe. It looked like the kind of spooky grand house you would see in an old movie. What struck me as very odd right away, though, was that Aunt Lucy seemed to completely avoid certain parts of her own apartment. She had this huge, beautiful master bedroom, with tall windows and gorgeous antique furniture, but she chose to sleep in a small, cramped den off the main living room instead. That was actually one of the first things I asked her about, to which she just replied rather coldly that the main bedroom got far too much morning light. I then stupidly asked if I could sleep in the master bedroom instead of the guest room, to which she just glared at me disapprovingly and changed the subject. You have to remember that things were a little different back then, and respecting your elders was practically an unwritten law. So after that brief, chilly interaction, I held my tongue, not wanting to upset her any further. The first few nights I was staying there, I kept hearing what sounded like someone walking around in the apartment directly above us on the 2nd floor. I figured it was just one of her tenants, maybe someone who worked late-night shifts and got home in the early hours of the morning. But the weird thing about the noise was how methodical and repetitive the walking sounded. It was a constant, steady pacing back and forth, like someone was walking the exact length of the apartment, over and over again. After about a week of hearing this every single night, I could not keep it to myself anymore, and I decided to mention it to Aunt Lucy over breakfast. She once again gave me this very strange, unreadable expression and told me that the 2nd floor apartment had actually been completely vacant for over a month. I insisted that I had been hearing someone walking around up there every night, but she just slowly shook her head and told me that I was just hearing the old wood of the building settling in the cold. Her explanation did not make any sense to me because the sounds were too rhythmic to be structural shifting, but I was not about to argue with her. The next morning I told Aunt Lucy that I wanted to go up and see the vacant second-floor apartment out of curiosity. She seemed very reluctant to let me, but I kept pressing her, and eventually, she sighed and agreed to take me up. Just like she had said, the second floor was completely empty of furniture, but as we walked through the dusty rooms together, I saw something on the floor that immediately validated everything I had been hearing. There were fresh, heavy scuff marks on the dark hardwood floors, like someone wearing boots had been walking the exact same path over and over. The marks formed a very clear, worn pattern from the front of the apartment all the way to the back, exactly matching the route the footsteps seemed to take each night. When I pointed this out to her, Aunt Lucy quickly said the marks were probably just left behind by the previous tenants, but they looked far too fresh and clean to be over a month old. I told her this, but she just dismissed me like I was some imaginative, babbling child and led me back downstairs. That evening, she surprisingly suggested that we watch a movie together in the living room, which was something we had never done before. As the night got later, the heavy footsteps from upstairs started up again right on cue. I looked over at Aunt Lucy, fully expecting her to finally acknowledge the loud noise we were both hearing, but instead of saying anything, she just grabbed the remote, turned the television volume up incredibly high, and pretended like absolutely nothing was happening. I was completely stunned by her reaction. My very first thought was that Aunt Lucy knew exactly what was going on up there and just desperately did not want to acknowledge it or tell me the truth. The next day, I called my mom on the phone and mentioned the creepy situation to her, and you know what is crazy? Even my mom seemed to already know about it. She did not sound surprised at all. Instead, she spoke in a very serious tone and told me not to bring up the footsteps with Aunt Lucy ever again, stating that it was a very sensitive family topic. One night near the very end of my summer visit, I woke up around 2 in the morning needing to use the restroom. As I was walking back down the hallway to my room, I happened to glance toward the wooden staircase that led up to the vacant second floor. The door at the bottom of the stairs, which was usually kept locked, was slightly ajar, and as I stared at it, I could have sworn I saw a faint, moving light reflecting on the wall up there, like someone was quietly walking around with a flashlight. I immediately ran back to my bedroom, locked the door, and did not mention a single word of it to Aunt Lucy the next day. I just wanted to get the hell out of that house and go home. If it had not been for that night we watched the movie together, I would have assumed Aunt Lucy was the one secretly walking up there, but she had been sitting right next to me the entire time. My mom flat out refused to explain anything to me when I finally got back home to our house, and this silence actually caused quite a rift between the two of us for several years. Years later, I found out through a distant cousin that Aunt Lucy had suddenly sold the entire Victorian building at a massive loss and moved down to Florida. According to my cousin, there had been some kind of dark incident in that second-floor apartment back in the 1990s. Someone had died up there under very unclear and suspicious circumstances, and the family had gone to great lengths to keep the entire thing quiet from the public and the local authorities. That was also around the exact same time that Aunt Lucy had inherited the building. I have never believed in ghosts or paranormal things. I do not say that to sound dismissive or close-minded, but I just genuinely do not believe in that stuff. I think resorting to supernatural explanations is a pretty lazy way to interpret things that you do not immediately understand, to be quite frank. So, when I think back on what I experienced in that old Vermont house, I always find myself searching for some other, more realistic explanation. Maybe Aunt Lucy was secretly harboring and sheltering someone up there in the vacant apartment, like a relative who was in serious legal trouble, or someone who desperately needed to stay hidden from the law. Or maybe she was being blackmailed by someone, forced to let them live secretly in her building without anyone else knowing. Maybe the suspicious death incident my cousin mentioned was not as closed as the family wanted to believe. and whoever was responsible for it still held some kind of terrifying physical leverage over her. Or maybe the entire story was completely made up by the family, and my cousin was just needlessly gossiping about old rumors. I really do not know the truth. What I do know is that my mom definitely knows the real story, and I will never fully forgive her for withholding that information from me when I was young and terrified in that house. I think this is just one of those deeply unsettling family mysteries that will never have a true, satisfying explanation. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.